So normally when you think lo-fi, you probably think lo-fi girl, but there's a ton of artists that use that style of beat, whether they're rapping or singing in their songs. I tend to think of artists like Code of the Friend, Anderson .Paak and the Free Nationals, Lute, J. Cole, just to name a couple of artists that do this kind of style. In this video, we're gonna walk through how I made this lo-fi hip hop beat, how I built out the drum tracks, what samples I chose for this, how I processed both of those, and what I did on my master bus to really make this come together. And if you want some free stuff, stay till the end. Let's get into it. All right, so for this track, I was really aiming for kind of a reference of 3 different songs. I was referencing Code of the Friend, Oregon. I was referencing a song called Eternal Light by Free Nationals and Chronics. And I was referencing an Anderson .Paak song called Come Down off of his album Malibu. So they all have this kind of hi-hat pattern, kind of sounds like somebody just doing a 16th note shuffle pattern on the hi-hat. We'll start looking at the drums first. I kind of split the drums into 2 different vibes. So firstly being more of a rim knock kind of verse section with like some conga percussion. And then for what I would see as the chorus, I used a really deep flat snare drum and some kind of, it sounds like some pingy hi-hats or cymbals or something. And I'll get to show you what that sounds like here in a second. But here is the verse section. And then this would be what I would consider like the chorus. So I actually started by building out each of these drum sections first. So we'll break this down piece by piece here. The kick is from the Circles Dead Disco pack, and then the hi-hat I chose is actually from the same pack. It is 2 different velocities of the hi-hat, so the B and the C. And that way I could alternate them and they feel a little bit more natural. Kind of gives that like double hit kind of thing. And to make it feel a little more, even more natural, as you can see, I offset the second hit. This is where the grid would be. So I offset the second hit ever so slightly. The softer hit is slightly after the beat. So as you can see, it just gives it a little bit more natural feel to it. And then we have a percussion sound, which is just a conga hit. Kind of just using it as like a, general kind of added percussion feel to give it some groove outside of just the kick and the snare. And for our snare in the verse, we're actually using a rim sound from Birdseed Samples. It's a killer rim sound. And then the same crash is from the same pack. Nice little 808E kind of crash. And that's pretty much it for the verse. I tried to keep it pretty straightforward. That's the other thing about these type of songs that I've really noticed when recreating this stuff is it's pretty minimal. You're really leaning into the lyrical aspects of it, so you want to leave as much space as possible. Oh, and one thing I did forget is I'm also adding a little bit of an open hi-hat, and that is also from the Circles Dead Disco sample pack for the drums. So I built that out, and then for the chorus section, I did a very similar thing, except I got rid of the rim and the conga and the open hi-hat. And I did some different things there to kind of change it up so it felt more like a chorus. So here's what that sounds like. So to really focus on the things I did differently, let's start with the snare. It's actually 2 snares layered on top of each other. So first snare is a cymatic snare I got from a free lo-fi pack from Cymatics. Very papery, kind of bright. There's a little bit of like a top end to it. And if you notice on the snare channel, I actually even took more top end off. So here's what the original sample actually sounds like, which is ended up being a little too bright for my taste. So I actually ducked it a little bit more and helped it feel a little more flat and less bright, and it didn't cut, makes it cut less, and that's kind of what I wanted for that snare. And then I layered that with a flatter snare, much more fat. And that snare is also from the Circles Dead Volume 2 kit. Very, very much a big fan of that kit for this like lo-fi dry kit kind of sound. And then I just kind of mixed them to taste here. And then in the context of the whole kit, for the ghost note snares, all I did was I dropped them like 6 dB each to give it more of a softer hit. Then instead of having the congas, I wanted to have this like tingy kind of percussion sound. So I found a pingy hi-hat, which is just like a stick hitting the bell of a hi-hat cymbal. And I pitched everything up 4 semitones. So the original sound sounded like this. And then now it sounds like this. Just a little pingier, a little tighter, a little higher. Kind of sits on top of everything else. And then haven't really done anything to this. A lot of the processing actually ended up being on the drum bus, which we'll get to in a minute. And so that pingy hi-hat really gives it just like a little bit of extra groove. And then the second half of the chorus, I added to kind of lean into the like bright pingy nature of the hi-hat. I added a ride ping on more of the right side. So instead of the open hi-hat doing like an open every other and kind of thing, I wanted to do that with a ride. So I picked this ride sound. Didn't really do anything to it processing wise. A lot of that is on the bus. And so whenever we get to that section, it just kind of adds this like and groove. Here it is. Just a little something, not anything too crazy. Very, very light, very subtle. And then the last little thing I did was a couple impacts. This one I actually made. It's this really cool triangle sound that I put through a bunch of compression and a kind of a flangery kind of effect. Makes it super wide and kind of warbles. And it's really cool in like transitionary moments. And that's kind of what I used it for. And then the only other thing I did was this cool little disco drop to kind of layer in with the triangle impact. And that disco drop sound is from Lo-Fi Drip Clips Volume 3, which I actually made another video about, which I'll put up here. If you want to check out that sample pack, it's really, really cool. I end up using a lot of the samples out of that for different kind of hip hop stuff, especially the retro feeling things. And that's pretty much the drums. So as far as processing goes, like I said, a lot of which I did on the bus. A couple things I did on the tracks. On the kick, I took out a little bit of low end because it was very subby. And so I needed to kind of control that a little bit more. The hi-hat, I didn't end up doing a lot there. The only thing I think I added was on the snare. I did that high cut I mentioned. And yeah, I think everything else is just based on the bus processing. So let's talk about that real quick. So I'll take all of the bus processing off and I'll let you listen to what it sounded like just as the samples were. That sounds really cool as is. We've got some really great sample choices, I think, for the style and kind of what we're going for. But there's some things missing here in general. And so for the drum bus, firstly, it sounded a little too hi-fi, and I wanted some compression. So I used this Time Machine plugin by Safari Pedals. Super cool plugin, especially if you want like very vintage or different time sounding stuff. So here's what that sounds like without it. And then with it. Without. And then with. So it does a lot of the gluing, gives the kick a little bit more like low mid presence, which is really nice. And then actually, because of the way that the Time Machine processes top end, it actually rolls off a little bit of the hi-hat. And I can show you just a quick why I landed on the 80 setting versus the others. So this is the 50s sound. It's cool, little too filtered though. Here's the 60s. Cool, but still kind of almost too bright. And I lost a little bit of the punch from the kick. The 70s is cool. I got my kick punch back, but still a little bright. But the 80s sound, in my opinion, rolls off some of that top end while still retaining some of that like 1 to 4K range, but rolling off some of like the tip top. So I didn't get so much roll off like the 50s, but I didn't get no roll off like the 70s. I feel like it was a little more of a balance while still retaining a lot of the kick feeling that I liked, which was like less of a subby kick and more of like a mid-rangey punch kick, which, as you'll see in a minute, works really well with the tracks that we're using for the instrumental bits. So now with this EQ, control where I wanted the top end to be controlled at, and I have a dip around 3K and a top end dip around 11K. So here's what it sounds like without it. And here's with it. So now I'm picking specific frequency areas that poke out a little too much in the broader mix. And while still retaining some of the top end presence, I'm able to be a little more specific than just like a general plugin like the Time Machine would be. And then the last thing, I felt like these drums felt a little bit too dry. Didn't feel like a drum kit. It felt like samples still. And so I wanted to combat that a little bit by using a room reverb to just kind of make everything feel like it was more in the same place, like it was being played on a real drum kit. So let's do before and after for that. And then let's add the room in. Let's take it out. Add it back in. So as you can see, that makes it feel a little more like we're all working in the same space with these samples now. It actually feels a lot less like samples and more like a really tightly recorded drum kit. Let's hear that room on the snare section. You can really feel the difference in this snare section. which was like the chorus. Adding the room verb. That snare sounds so dead there. But now it feels like the hi-hats and the snare are in the same drum kit rather than the individual samples that they actually are. So now that I had the right feel and direction that I was going for with the drums, kind of based on my references, I needed to find some really cool retro samples. The one I landed on is this Filigrani by Gianni Brezzo. Here's what that song sounds like. Super cool guitar jazz with like some horns or woodwinds or something behind it and a cool Rhodes. The other great thing about Tracklib that I love is that there's not a part in this song in the master where there's not drums playing, but I don't want their drums in my track because I want it to feel like the drums that I've already made. So they actually have the opportunity to give you the instrumental multi-tracks of this song. So here we have the bass, the brass, the drums individually, the guitars, and the Rhodes. So I downloaded these multi-tracks individually, and now I'm gonna hop back into the session to show you how I used them. So first things first, I went through and chopped out the sections that I thought would make the best verse and chorus and transitional sections. And then I brought them over under my drums, and then first things first, I detuned them actually a whole step, 2 semitones down, just to give it a little more of like that lo-fi sound and kind of make it feel naturally more degraded. So the sections I picked were this section for the verse, and then I found this section I really liked, and I decided to use it for like almost a pre-chorus transition into the chorus. And then I landed on this for the chorus. And then in verse 2, I actually picked a different section than verse 1 to give it some variation, since the drums tend to feel a lot of the same. I did a lot of the changing in the instrumental. This is the section I ended up going with for verse 2. And that transitions nicely right back into the chorus after that. The other thing I did was I wanted to use the drums from the original, more of like a callback. So for the intro and the beginning of verse 2, I actually used the drums there. And this is what that sounds like. And I wanted it to feel different, so I picked a specific ride focus section of the drums to put in the intro. And then for the second verse, I used a closed hi-hat kind of feel. But just throwing those drums in there felt a little weird. And I didn't really down tune them because sometimes pitching down drums can feel a little strange. So in order to give the drums more of a different vibe, I reached for the Bliss multiband compressor. And I went for their Disrespectful 2 preset and kind of tweaked from there. And this is what I got out of that. Super compressed, overly intentionally compressed sound. That sounds pretty cool. But then it kind of brought out some different areas that I wasn't a huge fan of. So then I added an EQ8 and kind of dipped out some of the low end and the top end. And now the drums sound like this. And then in context with the track, kind of gives it like this drums are really far away from the rest of the instruments. And for the rest of the samples, I didn't really touch the bass. I added a little bit of Valhalla vintage to the guitar because I wanted it to feel like a little more wide and spacey. I did the exact same thing for the brass, a little bit of Valhalla, and there's the settings for that. And then for the Rhodes, I did a little bit of a notch around 400, about a 4 dB, 5 dB notch around 400, and added some reverb to that as well on a much slower speed, decay speed, to give it some width without it being too long. And then on my sample bus for all of these samples except for the drums, I added some RC20. Big fan of RC20. And I noticed with the songs that I was referencing, especially specifically the Code of the Friend song, there's a ton of audible noise, vinyl tape noise, and magnetic noise and stuff. So I went a little heavier handed on the noise and the magnetic side of things for RC20 than I normally do. But that's kind of like a stylistic choice more so than, you know, what I would normally do. But since I'm emulating that song specifically as a reference, I decided to go a little bit heavier handed on that. So here's without RC20. And here's with it. I added a utility plugin, Ableton's utility plugin, to kind of center the bass a little bit more and widen the top end a little bit more, because I didn't want it to feel so much in the middle. I wanted it to feel a little more wide on the top, kind of surrounding the drum kit. So here's what that sounds with and without it. So here's without the utility plugin. And here's with. Utility plugin just kind of lifts and spreads out that top a little bit more so it doesn't feel so in the middle. And then the last thing I did was added kickstart to side chain everything off of the kick when the drums come in. Just to give it that pumping effect that I really, really like in this kind of lo-fi hip hop sound. And then we put all that together, and here's that section. Now I used the transitional section along with that disco drop sample I mentioned and that triangle sound that I made to kind of get us into the chorus. And then I also chopped, just kind of did a repeat chop at the end of a phrase as like a dropout to get us into the chorus. And here's how that sounds. And that got us into the chorus. Also, that pre-chorus introduced the brass in a nice way so that it's not just immediately coming in on the chorus. Felt a little bit more fluid of a transition to me. Then to get into the second verse, I did a repeat of the intro where I used the affected drums from the sample that were multi-band compressed and EQ'd slightly to kind of give a little bit more of a down feel, and then had the sample drums come in after 8 bars, and then that they play for the rest. So here's what that sounds like coming out of the chorus. And then halfway through this verse, the sample does something really cool. The track does, where the band kind of plays this ba-da-da-da-da kind of feel. So I wanted the drums to kind of match that, do a nice cut. So I did that halfway through the second verse. Did a drum cutout right before we get back into that chorus. That gave it a nice break. Dynamically felt really good to get back into that chorus. And then we play the chorus out, and the chorus is just a copy paste of the first one. Pretty straightforward, and I feel pretty good about where this beat ended up, to be honest. The last thing I wanted to show you is actually my master bus. So I have something really interesting going on my master bus, where this master bus is actually all Ableton stock plugins. So let me turn it off, and then I will show you what that sounds like and how big of a difference that's making for me as well. And then with the master bus on. And actually, I'm going to turn off the limiter so you can hear more of what this stuff is doing. So I'll go through this master bus real quick. It's just a simple utility plugin. If I needed to make any width changes or balance changes, if I needed to shift how my bass was feeling and where the crossover was, I could do that. Or if I needed to do any automation on the master bus, I could do that with the gain output knob here. Then I have a preset called the goalie preset. It's actually a preset that I made with my friend Lee Rouse, who's a great mixing engineer, fantastic guy. He had a SSL Fusion outboard EQ on his 2-bus. It was a physical, outboard unit, and this was an EQ he used on a couple songs that I really liked, and so I asked him to do a capture for me. I did a capture in Pro Q for that, and then he sent me the preset, and then I just recreated that preset inside of Ableton. And then we're going into a mastering glue compressor. I started with the mastering Make It Loud preset and kind of tweaked from there based on what I like, but it's doing some general glue, some loudness, kind of letting some of those transients punch through while kind of making everything feel a little more glued together. Then we have a saturation plugin, warming up the highs, doing a little bit of clipping, but I'm actually doing a very little of it in the grand scheme of things because my dry wet knob is only at 14%. So it's more of like a top end EQ that's smoothing everything out. It's a really nice trick that I've used across a lot of mixes and just with different plugins. So I just recreated it with this saturation plugin in Ableton. And then we go to the limiter, starting on the low latency preset and then kind of tweaking from there, doing a big gain boost so that we can get it loud. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. This plugin is just the U-Lean loudness meter. I'm just using it to track how loud everything is so I can make sure it's up to release standards so that when I send it off to somebody, it's loud enough that they can use it in one of their tracks. You can actually get a free version of that if you want. I'll put a link in the description for that if you want. But also, if you want this mastering bus, I will have it available for free. There's a link in the description to grab the mastering bus chain as well for free. I believe if you have at least Ableton Live Standard, you can use this mastering bus. I will probably make a version of it for the intro version and the more introductory versions of Ableton as well. But for this one, for now, it's just going to be called Drew's Mastering Bus, and it will be for free if you want to pick it up and just use it as something you can throw on, get everything loud, and kind of open your track up in a way that, you know, generically works pretty good. And that is how I built this lo-fi hip hop beat. If you want any more information, please drop a comment. Let me know what you thought. If I missed anything or you want more information about a specific thing, let me know down there in the comments. While you're down there, drop a like and a subscribe, and check the description for links to the Master Bus preset, the U-Lean loudness meter. If you learned something from this, or you want me to make a different type of beat and kind of do a walkthrough like this, let me know what I should make next down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.